A próxima conversa será sobre o cérebro em evolução, passado e futuro. É este o tema. As culturas e o mundo estão a mudar, certamente que algo no nosso cérebro também. E como terá sido a evolução do cérebro ao longo destes anos? É isso que vamos perceber agora, pois vamos receber um dos mais reputados neurocientistas dos dias de hoje. Ele é norte-americano e há mais de 4 décadas que estuda o cérebro, o equilíbrio entre os mecanismos conscientes e inconscientes e também os circuitos cerebrais de sobrevivência, sobretudo na relação com o medo e a ansiedade. Para nos contextualizar para o próximo painel e receber o professor José Ledoux, chama ao palco Sérgio Almeida, fundador do Seal Group e do Global Health Forum. Uma salva de palmas, por favor. Sérgio, a palavra é sua.
Muito obrigado. Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, Professor Joseph Ledoux. How are you?
Very good, and you?
Welcome to Portugal.
I'm sorry?
Welcome to Portugal.
Thank you.
Dear Professor, it's a great honor to have you with us. We are now facing pandemic times. Perhaps we are living the age of fear. In Portugal and around the world, people are trying to move forward. People are trying to understand how can survive in their daily life, in their business, in sports, everything. So with us, we have a tremendous scientist, also neuroscience, musician too, director of the Emotional Brain Institute, Nathan Kline Institute, professor of neuroscience, psychology, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, fellow of the New York Academy of Science, National Academy of Science of the United States of America, awarded scientist, a reference, and someone who really is going to bring us a lecture. I know it will be very, very relevant. So the deep story of ourselves, how we were and how we are, the evolution, the brain evolution, the human evolution. How can we move forward? This is our final question, and this is also the main idea of this conference. So, how we were and how we are, the evolution, the past, the present, and also projecting the future, it's some of the key words that we'll have right now with Professor Joseph Ledoux. Professor, thank you so much. Be our guest.
Thank you,
Welcome.
It's been a pleasure to work with you to set this up. So I was in Porto many years ago. I had a student working with me in New York who was from the university in Porto, Marta Moita. She's now a professor in Lisbon. And I think she might be on the conference today. I gave her the invitation, so hopefully she's joined us. But I very much enjoyed my short stay in Porto, and I hope to come back sometime. Right now, I'd like to share my screen with you. And can you please enable screen sharing? Okay, great. So hopefully you see a white screen now, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so let's get started. As Sergio said, we have some big questions we're going to try to address today. Who and what are we, for example? Why do we think and feel and act the way we do? Can we change, or are we destined to be who we are? And where are we going as a species? And how long will we last? So these questions will be kind of implicitly discussed as I go through, and some of them I will try to address it more directly at the very end. But the title of my lecture that I will use today is called "As Soon as There's Life, There's Danger." This is a kind of variation on a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American poet. His actual quote, Emerson's actual quote was, "As soon as there's life, there was danger." And I think what we have to get at is what all this means. And we're not talking about danger as something that happens when a baby is born. Of course, that's true. As soon as the baby is alive, it's subject to death, because in many ways, life is all about not being dead. But there's a deeper meaning to this piece of information, which is that the beginning of danger goes back to the beginning of life. And what we're talking about is a very, very long, old history, which I wrote about in this book called The Deep History of Ourselves, the 4 billion year story of how we got conscious brains. And I think the book is actually out in Portugal now, if I'm not mistaken. So, when we go back in time, where did Earth come from? We see Earth here on the right side of the picture. It's a planet. It cooled about 4.2 billion years ago. The Big Bang started 13.7 billion years ago. And all of the planets that we see on this are all of the components of the solar system that we see here. We see galaxies, the solar system itself. This is the universe. So we have the Big Bang, we have galaxies, solar systems. We have the molten Earth, which was too hot for life about 4.5 billion years ago. And then around 4.2 billion years ago, it began to cool. And roughly 3.7, 3.8 billion years ago, life began. Now, all of life is a chemical process. And all of chemicals that we have on Earth today that make up the so-called periodic table of chemicals are basically traces of stardust from the Big Bang. All of the chemicals that we live with are things that came from the Big Bang and that are still coming from meteorites and other things that enter our atmosphere. So the early chemistry of life we call prebiotic chemistry. So that was, you had some molecules like hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And some of those began to coalesce in a certain way to allow RNA to exist. RNA could replicate, and that sort of mutated into a kind of DNA that could also replicate and generate proteins and so forth through its replication processes. And these DNA molecules became trapped in the pores of rocks. This is a story. This is not a fact. This is a story, a well-accepted story by experts on the beginning of life. The DNA got trapped in small pores of rocks, and where it was trapped, as you can see on the screen here, I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, but it says rock pores, protocells. These were not actual cells. These were just spaces in which DNA was trapped. And within that trapped spot, the DNA began to replicate and making proteins through the RNA. And through RNA and DNA, elements began to form inside that allowed that thing to be an entity that when it escaped and formed a cell membrane became the first cells that ever lived. Now, you don't need to know all these details except to know that about some 4 billion years ago, there were early experiments with life, but the first cell that actually counted as life, this is called the last universal common ancestor of all of life, the first cell that was in the water that could actually survive on its own long enough to reproduce and generate offspring that could itself then reproduce and generate offspring occurred about 3.7 billion years ago. The earliest life forms that we know about that resulted from this were bacteria. Now, the first bacterial cell that ever lived and divided so that another cell could divide is the mother of all living things that we know today. In a sense, you could say that every bacterial cell that is alive today in your digestive system, for example, is an offspring of that original bacterial cell, because the way bacterial cells reproduce is by dividing in half. So that you start with one cell, you end up with two, and now each of those cells divides again. So all of the cells that resulted from that, dividing and dividing and dividing, are continuing that first cell, because that cell never went away. It divided in half, and it divided in half, and it divided in half. So there are traces of that first cell in every bacterial cell alive today. And bacterial cells are were a kind of prokaryote, a cell without a nucleus, and another kind was an archaeal cell. So these two unicellular organisms living billions of years ago were then combined to form what's called a eukaryotic cell. This is a cell with a nucleus in which the DNA is contained. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this, because what we need to know about all of life on Earth, life like us, all of the multicellular life that we can see, plants and animals and so forth that we see around the Earth, are these kinds of cells, eukaryotic cells that reflect a combination of bacteria and archaea. These cells became the basis of the first multicellular organisms about 900 million years ago, the first plants. Then the first animals were sponges about 800 million years ago. Then came animals that had a more symmetric kind of shape. Jellyfish, for example, they were round. Jellyfish have a top and a bottom, but not a left and a right or a front and a back. But animals with a left, right, front, back, and top, bottom, so-called bilateral animals, began about 630 million years ago. These were flatworms. And through the evolution of these, eventually we ended up with jawless fish and then jawed fish. These are vertebrates, animals like us with a backbone. And from these fish, we ended up with amphibians. And from them evolved reptiles, and from them evolved mammals, and from them evolved primates, and ultimately humans. So we live on the planet today because of this history that takes us back all the way to 3.7 billion years ago, when the first bacterial cells began to live and divide to give rise to all of life. So why did I write this book about the history of life? This is not something I'm an expert in by any means. It's not something that I've studied very much. But I had to write it because there was a problem I wanted to answer. I'd worked on so-called fear research for 35 years or so. Now we're talking about from 85 to 2000. From 1980 into the 2012s or something like that. So I worked on what we can call threat and defense, and this part of the brain called the amygdala, which became the centerpiece of this circuitry. We didn't discover it, but we found how it participated in threat processing by connecting finding out how the outside world, for example, conditioned stimulus, as we call that, or just say a stimulus in this case, is going into the brain, goes to a part of the brain called the thalamus, where it can get to the amygdala, but it can also get to the amygdala from the so-called cerebral cortex, sensory cortex. And within the amygdala, a part of the amygdala is activated, and that activates another part, and out comes all these responses that protect us in a dangerous situation. These are studies of rats, but the same thing happens in the human brain. So we defend ourselves by freezing or fleeing, running away. Our sympathetic nervous system drives our blood pressure and heart rate up in that situation to move blood around to help our behavior have the energy to be performed. Other parts of the autonomic nervous system are counteracting the sympathetic nervous system. Hormones are being released from this circuitry as well. and the brain is being aroused by the release of chemicals like norepinephrine, dopamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, things you've probably heard of. So this part of the brain, the amygdala, was well characterized, but now we need to know something about the cells and the molecules that make all this happen if we want to get into the basic mechanisms of how fear works in the brain and how threat works in the brain. So it turns out that the basic mechanisms of threat learning in a rat or a mouse or a human are the same, basically the same as in worms and flies and bees and slugs and so forth. So between invertebrates and vertebrates, there's a shared molecular machinery that participates in this process. It's not identical, but it's close enough that we can say that many of the molecules involved were acquired separately by vertebrates and invertebrates. But how did they get those molecules? Well, that means that in order for them to have those molecules, the same molecules, it must mean that they had a common ancestor that provided them with those molecules. And that common ancestor is believed to have been something like that flatworm that lived about 630 million years ago. So we learn about danger, and flies and bees learn about danger because we inherited, our kind of organism and their kind of organism inherited these genes and molecules underlying learning from an animal that lived 630 million years ago. That's kind of mind-blowing, and that's why I wrote the book, because I concluded that it probably didn't just begin there. So I kept looking at where it went. So let me go back here. So here we have early vertebrates about 520 million years ago. They share an common ancestor with invertebrates. That's that flatworm of 630 million years ago. And that flatworm shared a common ancestor about 700 million years ago with jellyfish and organisms like that. And that ancestor shared an ancestor with sponges, the first animals, which shared a common ancestor with single-cell protozoa, in this case, honoflagellates, but doesn't matter. Like protozoa is a sufficient term. These are not animals, but they have many animal-like properties, which I will tell you about. But they also have some of those same molecules. So these genes and molecules involved in learning are spread throughout all these animals. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at, for example, protozoa and bacteria, unicellular organisms, they have behavior despite not having a nervous system. That's really kind of surprising in many ways. Most people think that that behavior depends on a nervous system, but these animals will approach things that are useful to them and avoid things that are harmful to them. So they have ways of detecting what's useful and dangerous in their environment. This is a single cell. Again, no nervous system, just one cell that is able to do this. And they also learn. They exhibit classical or Pavlovian conditioning. They have sensitization, habituation, non-associative forms of learning. So only animals have a nervous system, but fungi, plants, protozoa, archaea, bacteria, all behave and all express some kind of learning. So behavior and learning do not require a nervous system, and they're as old as life. They are part of what was necessary for organisms to survive and pass their genes on to the next organism so that the rest of life could exist. So behavior didn't arise and persist for psychological reasons. We often think of behavior as a kind of ambassador of the mind in a sense. But behavior is simply a part of an organism's survival toolkit. So what are the requirements of a cell to stay alive? Well, it has to make energy. It has to have these physiological properties of making energy. It has to balance fluids and electrolytes or ions. It has to withdraw from harmful agents. And for its species to survive, it has to reproduce. What are the survival requirements of an animal like us? They're exactly the same. Make energy, balance fluids and ions, withdraw from harmful agents, reproduce. Now, of course, we do these in different things than bacterial cells do, but we still have to do them. So in a way, we can say, we can follow this history of life and the history of detecting and responding to danger all the way through the first plants, first animals, vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, primates, humans, all the way to us. Now, not all of these organisms have an amygdala, only vertebrates have an amygdala, so from here forward, but all of these organisms with a nervous system, which includes all the invertebrates, have a way of detecting and responding to danger. But even plants have to detect and respond to danger. Plants will withdraw their roots from toxic areas and redirect them towards areas where there are nutrients. They find water and move away from dry areas. Even protozoa detect and respond to danger. Even bacterial cells detect and respond to danger and balance fluids and all of this. So detecting danger is as old as life. It's not about psychology, it's about staying alive. Unfortunately, we sometimes project our emotions, when we are in danger, we feel afraid. And so we project that onto other animals because, for example, rats and mice like us will freeze to danger, flies will freeze to danger. So we say that rats and mice and flies are freezing because they're afraid. But that's not really why they're freezing. We have no idea what's going on in the brain of a fly or a rat or a mouse, but it's unlikely to be what goes on when we experience fear for reasons I'll explain later. So, sometimes I write songs that go with my books, and so I'm going to play a song for you right now that I called As Soon as There's Life, There's Danger, from the book Deep History of Ourselves. And it kind of tells the whole story of life. At first, you'll hear a big noise. What happened? Got to get back there. At first, you'll hear a noise that, okay. See if I can do this without making it go backwards. You'll hear a noise that reflects the kind of the lightning that struck the pond that made the first living organisms, according to Darwin's, primordial soup hypothesis. So here's, as soon as there's life, there's danger. That's the beginning of life. Okay, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but at the end of the lecture, I'll tell you where you can listen to the music. Okay, so here we are again, back to the amygdala. And through the years that I've worked on it, the amygdala became what's called a fear center, a place that out of which fear is supposed to emerge. Here we have, find all kinds of stuff on the internet. Here's a picture of the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. Here's a monster in a cartoon called Amygdala. It's not a good guy. Here we have someone called Neil Slade, who has a website where you can click your amygdala forward, how to click your amygdala forward and eventually pop your frontal lobes just by reading through this site. Of course, you have to pay to get there, so it can give you intelligence, pleasure, and even ESP. It's like wiggling your finger, only it happens inside your brain. Pretty funny, anyway. This is Neil Slade. He's a very self-congratulatory man. Got his fancy car right there, all from clicking his amygdala. The origin of clicking your amygdala, though, is from this guy, TDA Lingo. I don't know if I trust anything from him. Astonishing facts. By removing the amygdala from the brain, a person stops feeling fear. But we'll see. So what's wrong with the fear center idea? Well, I mean, it's very popularly known. Many of you have probably heard about the amygdala and fear and what fear is supposed to do to your amygdala and how it comes out of the amygdala and so forth. But, for example, behavioral and physiological responses don't always correlate with subjectively experienced fear. So, a rat that is, or let's say a person that's freezing and its blood pressure is going up doesn't necessarily feel fear and danger. But the person can also feel fear without blood pressure and heart rate going up and without freezing. So this is not a very good way to test it. And if we can't use, these responses to tell if a human is feeling afraid, how can we then attribute fear to the amygdala of another animal? Another point is, we can present stimuli to the brain non-consciously, in other words, subliminally. That will activate the amygdala. A picture of a snake will activate the amygdala. The person's heart will be beating fast, their palms will sweat, but they won't have any awareness of what the stimulus is. They won't report feeling fear or have any experience of fear. And yet the amygdala is producing the outward responses. So the amygdala can't be the seat of that fear because no fear is coming out, despite the fact that the threat is there and the responses are there. And then finally, damage to the amygdala interferes with the ability to elicit these responses, but doesn't necessarily eliminate the feeling of fear. So we need a different way of thinking about this. So in 2012, I began to try and address this problem because I was tired of being introduced at lectures like this as the person who had shown how the amygdala makes us feel fear. So I tried to change things around. Instead of talking about the amygdala as a fear center, I talked about it as a defensive survival circuit, a circuit that detects danger and produces protective responses like freezing or running away and so forth, or changes in blood pressure and heart rate and all of those things, hormone release. So this way we're not attributing fear to a place where it doesn't exist in the brain. Why does it matter what we call things? Well, I'm going to give you an example. So let's say in physics, it doesn't matter, like a physicist gives cute names to particles like quarks, or that a biologist might talk about, genes such as, there's a gene called hedgehog. So when a biologist is talking about hedgehog, no one believes that there's a hedgehog living in that gene. But when psychologists and neuroscientists talk about the amygdala as a fear center, people believe that fear is living in the amygdala, and that is absolutely wrong in my opinion. So, in 1620, Francis Bacon said scientists should be vigilant and guard against tacitly granting reality to things simply because we have words with them. The common language is full of psychological assertions, and the language which these is framed is inadequate. Psychologists tend to be sloppy with words. Summary labels and shorthands control the way we think. There's a semantic danger that results when a common language term is used as a scientific name And the variable or construct with the name becomes infected with the subjective properties of the common meaning of the word. And in the case of fear, that's exactly what's going on. Because we use fear to describe behavior, the amygdala became a fear center, and therefore most people think fear comes out of the amygdala as a subjective experience. Now here's two medication scenarios. The one on the left, scenario A, is the one that we traditionally have heard about in the field of psychiatry. The psychiatrist will tell the patient, the medication will turn off your fear center. You'll be able to go to the party and not feel anxious. Scenario B, it's more about physical symptoms. The medication affects symptoms that control behavioral and physiological responses in challenging situations. You'll find it easier to go to the party. You'll be less avoidant and will feel less jittery, less aroused. And while you'll probably still feel anxious, you'll be better able to cope with the situation and can use the medication as a way to become physically more comfortable being there. This is not a cure, but it may help you cope with your symptoms. So this is the normal, and unfortunately the not really true explanation. And this is really what happens. I mean, the way these drugs are developed in animal research is you put a rat or a mouse in a challenging situation, and if the rat or the mouse is acting less timid, it's assumed that it's less fearful, and therefore a person will be less fearful when it takes the drug. But really what the drugs are best at is reducing behavioral timidity and arousal, not in changing the way a person feels fear. So how does fear come about then? Well, drugs are designed in the animal studies to work here on this defensive survival circuit. But if people are feeling consciously afraid in cortical cognitive circuits, it's not surprising that the drugs don't work. And I do think that that's how fear comes about, as a conscious experience, by the cognitive interpretation of the situation we are in. So here we have a cognitive system that we'll call working memory. This is a common term in cognitive psychology, where we can monitor and appraise and attend to the outside world. We can have thoughts and we can introspect and give verbal reports about all of this. And what is it we're doing all this with? Well, we've got sensory information coming in here, semantic memory, memories about facts that you know, episodic memory, memories about experiences you've had, self-memories, memories about who you are and what you're like, emotion memories, things you know about emotion that you've learned over the course of your life. The survival circuit is active. It's producing brain arousal and body responses that are feeding back. So all of this is coming together in working memory, and fear is the integration of all these things into an experience of what's happening to you at the moment. Without you being part of the experience, it's not an emotion. If the snake is not going to bite you, you're not afraid of it. Now, the thing is that you can be afraid of a lot of things, not just snakes and other kinds of predatory dangers. But if you're stuck on top of a mountain and you're out of water or food, your energy balance systems and your fluid balance systems are telling your hypothalamus, your brain, about a threat to your body from sources internally because of deprivation. But you can be afraid that you will die on the mountaintop for lack of these things because you're getting these sensations from your body. So there are lots of ways to be afraid, and not all of them involve the amygdala and predatory threats. So one thing that I'd like to point out is that fear is not universal. It's danger that's universal. We often hear that fear is expressed the same all around the world. No, what's expressed around the world is behavior. What you see is behavior. You don't see the fear itself. Fear is inside the head. All humans must deal with danger, and all cultures have words for danger and words for experiences that occur when in danger. But experience varies across culture. Not every culture experiences emotions in exactly the same way. But because we can translate words like fear across cultures, we assume that people worldwide have the same basic experience named by the word. Now, cultural differences are based on differences in the memory schema that have been learned as being a person who has grown up in that culture. So we have our fears are based not only on what we know about danger from having acquired that knowledge about danger in our life, but also about what we know about danger in our culture, because that's how we interpret our own experiences. Animals lacking our kind of cognition can't have our kind of emotional schema, our kinds of memories, our kinds of fear. It doesn't mean they have no fear. We don't know what they have, but whatever they have, they don't have what we have. So what's an emotion? So very simply, I think it's a narrative driven. In other words, we generate narratives. There's a little voice in your head that's narrating everything you do. And you can't go to sleep at night because that narrator just won't shut up, you know. So we have a narration that's going on all the time. And so an emotion is a narrative driven subjective experience in a biologically or psychologically significant situation. It's a very simple definition, but I think it's right on. So we talked about all this already, so I don't know why I have that here. I'm going to skip that. So here we are we're getting to the end now. I was only supposed to talk for 30 or 40 minutes. I hope I didn't go too long. So who and what are we? Well, we are biological organisms that can think and feel and predict our future because we have a brain with a prefrontal cortex that's able to anticipate the future. Kierkegaard said that, anxiety is the basis of our ability to predict the future is the basis of our anxiety. And I would say that the prefrontal cortex is the basis of our ability to predict the future. So we can think about, and because we have a prefrontal cortex that differs from even other primates, our ability to predict the future is different from other animals. So why do we think and feel and act the way we do? Because of our history as a species, a member of a culture, and as an individual. Can we change, or are we destined to be who we are? We can't change our genes, but we can change our minds and our behavior. And given that our emotions, in a way, are in our minds, that means that we have the opportunity to change by changing our beliefs. Now, beliefs are hard to change, and one of the problems we have in the world now is that people are unwilling to, get involved in a process of that might change their beliefs by changing the information that they believe things about. But beliefs are at the core of many of our problems, but also many of our good things. Where are we going as a species? I would say our direction is not good, both psychologically, biologically, and physically. How long will we last? Well, mammals as a species, in general, on average, last about 1 to 2 million years. So where are we in this scheme? Okay, so we are a member of the animal kingdom. Our phylum is Chordata. Our class is mammals. We're in the order of primates. And within the primates, we are hominids, which we share. This is a group we share with apes and chimpanzees and so forth, the orangutans. Our genus is Homo, and our species is Sapiens. So the good news is, as I said, mammals on average, and we're a mammal, last about 1 or 2 million years. We're only about 200,000 years into that. So potentially we got we got more than a million, at least 800 million years to go on average, maybe another million after that, another million after that, 800,000 to go after. So if 200,000 and we've used up 200 of either 1 or of 2 million. Does that make sense? Sorry. Anyway, we got some time left if we do the right thing. But here's the story. So our conscious capacities have made possible our greatest achievements as a species. Art, literature, music, architecture, science, medicine, but also they're responsible for our most troubling and base dispositions: selfishness, narcissism, greed, envy, tribal jingoism, hatred, and evil. We know a lot about these things in people around us these days because we have such different beliefs in our societies and around the world. There's so much hatred coming from these beliefs about how we think things are and should be. These proclivities challenge our ability to coexist within and between social groups, and also threaten the planet and its habitability for our descendants and for other species. Each species we lose to natural causes or to human short-sightedness alters the balance of biological power and ultimately affects our ability to survive as well. Our current lifestyle is making the planet less habitable for us and for many other life forms. We're the only species that has ever been able to predict our own possible demise. And that is what we're doing, in a way, in this lecture. I heard right before me in the discussion before my lecture, I like the expression, there is no planet, there's no plan B and no planet B. This is our planet, and this is where we live and where we die. And we're moving closer to the direction of where we die right now. When we go, the Earth will survive just fine without us. We often hear, we're destroying the Earth. We're not destroying the Earth. The Earth has survived dramatic catastrophes from, meteorites and all kinds of things that have happened to the Earth, and it survives. But the question is, who will survive when the Earth survives? History tells us that mass extinctions change this balance of power. So when the dinosaurs died, were extinguished, that allowed small, little tiny creatures who had very low energy demands to survive. Dinosaurs were large, they had huge energy demands. When the climate changes, the large energy demanding organisms can't survive, but little tiny things did. And one of the little tiny organisms that survived were the early mammals. Mammals were very low on the food chain. They were just, they were food for dinosaurs. But when the dinosaurs were gone, the mammals were able to invade new niches, develop new capacities, expand in size, and become humans ultimately, and other primates and all kinds of, so many mammals around the Earth today, of all sizes. We have the biggest animals on Earth and the smallest animals on Earth within the mammals. The bacteria will surely make it when the climate conditions turn, when they get to as bad as they might get, and so bad that life begins to not be possible. Many other organisms may survive as well. But the big energy demanding organisms, right now we are the biggest energy demanding organisms on Earth, are the ones that are going to go. So our future is in our hands, metaphorically, in our conscious minds, literally. It's only through our decision to live, to coexist as a world, as a species, as a kind of organism with all other humans, can we survive as a species. We will not manage to use that extra 800,000 years we have, or even extra billion years we have, if we don't come together and figure out a solution to hatred, to conflict. We have to live together, and we have to work together on the climate. Otherwise, there will be nothing for us to do. So all of this is from the deep history of ourselves, more or less all of it. And as I said, I think it's out in Portugal at this point. There's a website, deep-history-of-ourselves.com, where you can find out all kinds of information about the book. There's interviews, excerpts, reviews, all kinds of stuff. There's merchandise, like my No Self, No Fear t-shirt. I don't know if you can see that. You can get one of those on this website. And also the music. So there's a No Self, No Fear t-shirt. And the music, Songs of Life, is free, no charge for that. It's just 4 little songs. I played part of one of them. And I'm going to close out with another one called Life, Plain Old Life, Life Itself. Optimistic.
Also things that I think that I tell. Can't keep straight on the things in my mind. Too many thoughts and too little time. Life, life. Mistakes of mine, they come and go. Sometimes fast and sometimes slow. Some leave a trace in my brain. Others just wax and wane. Life, life.
My musical partner, Colin Dempsey, singing with me there in our little acoustic duo group called So We Are. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to stop sharing. And
Thank you so much, Joseph Ledoux. We have here 3 in 1, the neuroscientist, the author, and the musician. We started with fear. We started talking about cells evolution 900 years ago. We talk about the amygdala. I really love the amygdalas. I hope one day we can have you in Portugal, in Matosinhos, in this beautiful... I will invite you to visit us. If you accept, we have excellent seafood here. We enjoy. Professor Eric Kandel has enjoyed so much to come to our town. So this is a promise. I will invite you, Professor. Thank you so much for sharing with us the anxiety, the idea about drugs. As soon as there is life, there is danger. And also, what you explain is that we can talk about danger, fear, we can talk about emotions, but we don't have enough words to explain all of this. So we keep creating new words to different emotions, and sometimes it's different to understand what is inside of us and bring this to a simple word. But you have, in your fantastic lecture, simple words, very understandable for all of us. You talk about fear, but what you really bring to us, Professor, was hope. You ended with life. You supported your intervention in the past, but you led us a message to the future. So I want to thank you for your lecture. I also keep this in mind, our invitation to visit Portugal. And I make this as my final statement. I still have 1 or 2 million years to live, so this is very good, in my opinion. Thank you for the life you bring to our conference. Keep safe, dear Professor. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.